Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Ashley.
And I'm Xander.
And today we're diving into the sophisticated and sometimes confusing land of Japan. I really enjoyed it. The food was great, the people were really friendly, and everything was orderly and on the dot. Basically my natural habitat.
Our trip to Japan was split into two parts, more on that later, and they were pretty different. One was filled with packed streets and edgy manga, and the other one was slower paced and less crowded. Now, this would be a good time to break down the trip. We were using Singapore as our home base, since we could leave any extra things at our grandma's place. We'd visit China, Mongolia, and Japan before and after China. For our first part in Japan, we were supposed to visit Tokyo and Hiroshima, and in our second, Osaka and Yokohama. With that in mind, we left Singapore's Changi Airport at midnight on a red-eye flight bound for Japan. Our flight to Tokyo was on a Boeing 777-200ER, basically the little brother of the 777-300ER. We flew with Japan Airlines, another first for us, and once again, we got business class. Unfortunately, I had just gotten food poisoning for a second time this trip, just the day before we left, back in Singapore, and I was still recovering. Our plane took off at midnight, and we arrived at 7 a.m., so that means we got to sleep during the flight, although the city was already up and running. If you don't already know, hotels here are really expensive, so we booked 2 rooms at the Moxie. Although we had 2 rooms, I'm certain they could both fit in a standard hotel room. I mean, they were tiny, but pretty comfortable. Unlike Vietnam, where we all got over our food poisoning within 48 hours, I'm pretty sure I caught something else after the main symptoms disappeared. I spent the next 4 days chilling in the small hotel room, lying in bed and enjoying non-stop diarrhea. So the day I felt well enough to go out and do things, we wandered around Tokyo. The only thing we actually had planned was a maid's cafe. Based off of your knowledge on Japan's edgy fetishes, just try to make a guess.
Gold, crystal, platinum, black, super black.
The maid's cafe was definitely an interesting experience. It was a weeaboo's dream.
Maid cafes are interesting. They're not all exactly the same, but they follow the same principles. First, let's talk about the waitresses. They're all women, I think, and you have to act and look super pretty and innocent to get hired as one. The maids wear a French maid-inspired outfit, usually paired with white stockings and hair accessories like cat ears, bows, or frills. You can play extra to play board games or take a picture with them because you aren't allowed to take pictures of the maids yourself. Speaking of which, rules. Every maid cafe has a basic set of rules which are generally the same. No taking pictures of the maids and sometimes the interior of the cafe, which explains our lack of photos here. No touching the maids, no asking for personal information, and just no being a creepy stalker in general. Then there's the actual cafe part. You can buy coffee or other drinks along with entrees and desserts. Most of what you order can be glammed up with a surprisingly good drawing of an animal of your choice. Maids will write in chocolate syrup for coffee and desserts and in ketchup for omelets. They are mini art pieces. One thing to point out about everything on the menu is that it's not the cheapest. The same applies to just about every purchasable item in the cafe, which is expected because they're so popular and have long lines to get in, even with multiple floors.
I was happy to leave the maid's cafe, and we just continued wandering the streets of Tokyo before stumbling upon a hedgehog cafe. It's exactly what the name implies. It's a cafe with a bunch of hedgehogs you can pick up and pet. It didn't really interest me, so my dad and I left my mom and sister there while we continued walking around.
At some point, I decided to try some vending machine ice cream for the reasonable price of 180 yen, about $1.50. It was really good. Even if you're not that familiar with this country, you've probably heard that Japan is the motherland of vending machines and that they sell basically everything. Yes, you can find them absolutely everywhere and lining every block, but they mostly just sell drinks and ice cream.
One of the first things we saw while driving to our local hotel was this tall building off in the distance. The fact that it was the only structure taller than a few hundred feet made it stick out like a sore thumb. And it was strange, since Tokyo was well known for having earthquakes, and having a tower that tall would just not make sense. It's called the Tokyo Skytree, and it's a few metro stops away from our little hotel. The Skytree is basically the Space Needle we have in Seattle, but a little taller. Though there were 2 observation decks, we went to the lower one, because it was cheaper and you get pretty much the same view. The crowds up there were an absolute nightmare, as having hundreds of people clogging up the pathways made it hard to move anywhere. Now, we were actually supposed to visit this museum about instant noodles or something like that, but I was sick and Dad was also sick, so we figured we'd just go to it during the second half of our trip after China. On top of that, we were supposed to fly to Hiroshima on day 6, but since Dad and I were both sick, we had to cancel the flight. While I was getting better, my dad's condition seemed to be getting worse. The last few days in Tokyo were fairly uneventful, and before we knew it, we were back in the airport ready to head for China. Now, China doesn't belong here, so let's fast forward a little bit. 1.5 months later, we're back in Shanghai, ready to head back to Japan. We had to take 2 different planes. First an ANA flight from Shanghai to Haneda in coach, then hopping on another ANA domestic flight to Osaka after a 3-hour layover. We landed at Kansai International Airport at around 4 and had dinner there while we were waiting for our bus. Our hotel was a Hyatt Regency, a fairly large hotel with decent rooms, and it was only a 2 minutes walk to the nearest subway station. Well, not really subway, but it gets there. Now about Osaka, most of the activities were planned with my sister and mom in mind, such as tea and animal-related things, so I don't really have much to talk about except trains and planes.
In a very last-minute plan, Dad decided to book us for a cooking class. When we woke up, he was like, "Hey, so we're going for a cooking class, like right now."
No, we did breakfast. Today's a Saturday.
The class was really fun, and I enjoyed it more than the one we did in Vietnam because it was slower paced and we did things I was more familiar with. We made a whole meal, pickled carrots, tamago, goma. I don't know how to pronounce this, so
Omae.
miso soup, ginger pork, and shiratama dango. Everything tasted really good, and I learned a bunch of tricks to add to my general knowledge of cooking.
After the cooking class, my dad was planning to bring us to this marketplace in an alley. It was basically the market we visited in Saigon, but cleaner and didn't reek of seafood. The rows of shops there sold a wide variety of food, including crabs, squid, octopus, and Kobe beef. I'm sure you've heard of it before. It's the very fatty beef that no one can afford. Since we had a tea lover in our family, we went to a tea ceremony. Basically, we all dressed up in traditional Japanese clothes and watched someone serve us tea.
We were given something called shiro-an, which is a white moldable bean paste, kind of like marzipan, or if you squint, fondant. The teacher gave us a brief tutorial on coloring and shaping it into a flower, then gave us extra and let us make whatever we wanted. The tricky parts were not staining your hands, and if you handled it too much, it would get sticky and all mushy. Mom and I are familiar in the whole decorating area, so our work may not have been a masterpiece, but they were pretty good. Other attempts were slightly more unfortunate. After we finished messing around, we each chose one to eat at the tea ceremony and kept the others in little boxes. We moved to a room upstairs for the tea ceremony. Videos aren't allowed, so just make do with what we have. The person making our tea was called the tea master. She was very friendly and explained to us that the traditional way to make matcha had hundreds of rules on how to perform basically every single action that you could possibly make. Every movement she made was deliberate and careful. When she poured the hot water, she didn't spill a single drop, even though the scoop was really weird and not easy to pour. She showed us how to clean the tools, then made the matcha and let us whisk it. The reason tea masters traditionally prepare everything in front of the guests is that assassins used to slip poison into people's tea, so letting you see it being made shows that they're not trying to kill you.
On one of our days, we were planning to take a commuter over to Kyoto to visit the Arashimaya bamboo forest, one of the world's largest bamboo groves. It really is something to see with tall stalks of bamboo on both sides of the paths. Being one of Kyoto's top parks, however, combined with its free entry, makes it an extremely popular tourist destination. If you are able to ignore the hordes of noisy tour groups and clusters of people blocking the path for a selfie, then yeah, this place is amazing. However, it wasn't the nicest thing to be literally swimming through the crowd, so we found the Okochi Sanso Villa just to the side of the bamboo forest. It was built by a rich movie star back in the 30s by the name of Denjiro Okochi. It had a couple of shrines, a beautiful garden, and a little tea house that we could get some matcha at. I think the villa was better than the bamboo forest, mainly because it was much less crowded and noisy there.
After that, Mom's dream came true. We got to grind matcha. We all had different levels of interest in the topic, but I found it quite satisfying. We ground the leaves in a spinning stone mill. The whole process took quite a long time because do it too fast and the powder would be gritty and bitter. Then we brushed it into a sieve to get rid of the clumps and made the tea. Let me just say, whisking is a pretty good wrist workout.
I'm fine with this, you know. The next day, we took another commuter over to Nara, a little town famous for deer. As in, deer walking around the entire town. Yeah, I'm not really an animal guy, so that was fun.
Nara is home to over 1,000 wild deer. There's a park called, surprise, surprise, Nara Park that houses most of the deer that come and go and are all very comfortable with urban life. They'll even go as far as chasing and biting people for food, so maybe too comfortable. You aren't allowed to feed them anything other than the crackers that the park vendors sell. Some deer have been conditioned to bow in exchange for treats. Ah, Japan. I spent the entire time doing just about 4 things. Taking pictures or videos of the deer, petting the deer, feeding the deer, or just adoring the deer in general. I'm pretty sure this whole day was mostly planned for me, so thanks Dad and Xander for tolerating my fangirling.
The next day, we decided to head over to the aquarium, just a 10-minute subway ride away.
I'm not going to cover every species of animal that was there, which I totally would, but for your sake I won't. There were fish, moorfish, starks, stingrays, otters, capybaras for some reason, dolphins, sea lions, seals, jellyfish, and just about everything in between. Oh, and the legendary sunfish! My personal favorite were the dolphins, not only because I love dolphins, but also because they were playing and having fun. Then came the whale sharks. They swam around in circles while everyone oohed and ahed at them. A few hundred fish later, we went to the interactive exhibits. And upstairs there were ring seals. Oh, they're so cute. Part of it was an open enclosure, so you could throw things at the seals, but please don't. Overall, the aquarium was really fun and interesting, and I would recommend it to anyone who doesn't have time to travel the world and see the animals for themselves.
We flew out to Yokohama after spending a week in Osaka. During our flight, I managed to catch a sweet view of Mount Fuji, although you can't really see anything from my potato camera, but it was nice.
The main reason we came to Yokohama was to visit the Nissin factory. You may know it by its cup noodles, the iconic instant ramen that everyone has tried at least once. Our first activity was making our own cup noodles. We bought a bunch of blank cups from vending machines and drew on them with markers. Then we went to the production line, where we filled it with noodles and got to pick seasonings and toppings to go into the cup.
Okay, garlic chip.
4 choices. What do you want to put in yours?
To make sure it didn't get crushed during transportation, we stuck them in these little arm floaty handbags. Thanks to Dad, we got the opportunity to make instant ramen from scratch. Of course, this isn't how they actually make it. Everything is done by a machine. But this is more fun. And they make more money this way. We don't have much footage of this part just because our hands had to be sanitized when working with the dough, so Dad would film and only jump in when I needed help. When we finished the entire process, they sealed our noodles in packets and gave us a goodie bag of different types of instant ramen. Instant ramen was invented during the post-World War II food shortage, when a man named Momofuku Ando wanted to create a food that would feed the hungry. He discovered that flash-frying ramen made it dry out and harden, and adding hot water turned it into its cooked state. We spent the next couple of days hanging out. We went out for sushi with a friend, but I'm not the biggest fan of raw fish, so I just ate tamago. And that was about it. Sushi is made with a slightly sweet vinegared rice and seafood, vegetables, or occasionally tropical fruits. Most sushi has raw fish in it, but there are plenty of non-raw options. There is just about an endless amount of ways to prepare and present sushi. I mean, you could just pile rice and fish onto some seaweed and eat it like a taco, though everyone will probably hate you.
We only stayed in Yokohama for 3 days, and before we knew it, we were back in Tokyo Haneda Airport, waiting in Japan Airlines business class lounge. We flew the same plane as the first flight to Japan, and our flight was almost identical. Took off late, arrived before sunrise. And that completed the largest chunk of the trip. And that wraps up Japan.
This has become one of our favorite places to visit, and we'll probably come back. The overall atmosphere was quite light and peaceful, well, maybe except for some parts in Tokyo, but if trudging through rainforests and being eaten alive by mosquitoes isn't really your thing, you might enjoy a visit here. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all later. Bye!
Bye.
That escalated quickly. Rescue.
Oh, jeez. Oh, that's a pretty savage fire. Oh, that poor guy.
That was the rescue. It gave up its life.
No.